In 2019, a genetics lab in Leipzig runs a comparison nobody expected to commission. Not looking for disease markers, not running a paternity test. They're stacking modern Arab DNA against the genetic signatures of civilizations that stopped existing 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. And then one of them, just one, comes back as almost a perfect match. Not close, not related in a broad sense. An almost perfect match. And the civilization it matches is not the one anyone guessed. Here's what makes this worth 15 minutes. The Arab world spans 22 countries, over 400 million people, stretches from the Atlantic coast of Morocco all the way to the Persian Gulf. It's one of the most geographically vast and historically layered human groups on the planet. When scientists actually run the genetics, not theorize, not assume, but sequence ancient bones and compare them to living people, what they find doesn't fit the story that either the Arab world or Western academia wanted to tell. It complicates both narratives at once. Since, let me walk you through what they found, and more importantly, what they had to rule out first. The first assumption that gets tested and fails is the obvious one. If you ask most people where Arab DNA should anchor, they'd say the Arabian Peninsula. The cradle of Islam, the birthplace of the Arabic language, the Hejaz, the Najd, the ancient desert heartland, makes perfect sense. Ancient Arabs were peninsula people. Their DNA should trace back to some ancestral population that lived on that sand for 10,000 years, isolated by desert and sea. Except it doesn't. Not quite.
When researchers sequence ancient skeletal remains from the Arabian Peninsula, bones pulled from Neolithic sites in Saudi Arabia, burial mounds in Oman, cave sites along the Red Sea coast, the genetic signature they get is surprisingly mobile.
These people were not isolated. They were trading and migrating and mixing with populations from the Levant, from East Africa, from what is now Iran. The ancient Arabian Peninsula looks less like a sealed vault of preserved ancestry and more like a crossroads. And crossroads don't produce simple genetic stories. They produce complicated, layered ones. So the "we came from the desert" narrative runs into its first wall pretty fast. The second assumption that gets tested is what you might call the Semitic origin hypothesis. The idea that Arabs, Jews, Assyrians, Phoenicians, Canaanites, all these Semitic language-speaking peoples, share a common genetic root, some population that branched off and became all of them. In linguistic terms, this is solid. Semitic languages really do share a common ancestor. The grammar holds. But genetics doesn't follow grammar.
When you compare modern Arab populations to ancient Canaanite DNA, and we have Canaanite DNA now extracted from Bronze Age sites in Lebanon and Israel, from populations that lived between 3000 and 1000 BCE, the overlap is real, but it's partial.
Some modern Arab populations, especially in the Levant, do carry significant Canaanite ancestry. Lebanese, Syrians, Palestinians, Jordanians. There's a thread there, running across 4,000 years. But here's where it gets genuinely complicated. The Arab world is not one genetic population. Moroccan Arabs look genetically different from Yemeni Arabs. Egyptian Arabs look different from Iraqi Arabs. When you run each of those groups against ancient civilization samples, you don't get the same answer for all of them. The question, which ancient civilization do Arabs match, only makes sense if you hold Arabs as a single genetic block, and the data refuses to cooperate with that framing.
Which is exactly what the researchers figured out they had to work around.
So they did something more precise. They pulled the genetic center of gravity. They identified the populations that form the statistical core of modern Arab genetic identity. Across multiple studies, across different sampling methods, across different geographic clusters, and they ran that core signature against every ancient civilization sample in the database. Ancient Egyptians, ancient Mesopotamians, Natufians, those prehistoric hunter-gatherers who lived in the Levant 15,000 years ago.
Bronze Age Anatolians, Dilmun culture remains from burial mounds in Bahrain. Pre-dynastic populations from the Iranian plateau, ancient populations from the Horn of Africa, from the Caucasus, from the fringes of Central Asia.
Every ancient civilization whose DNA they could sequence. The question was simple. Which one does the modern Arab genetic core most closely resemble? The answer was the Natufians. Not the ancient Egyptians, which surprised a lot of people given how deeply Arab and Egyptian history are intertwined. Not the Mesopotamians.
And this is the one that really catches people off guard, despite the fact that Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, is where writing was invented, where the earliest cities were built, where civilizations like Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon rose and collapsed and rose again.
Not even the Bronze Age Levantine populations, despite those being geographically closest to the Arab world's modern heartland. The Natufians.
If you don't know who the Natufians were, here's the version that matters. They were one of the most consequential human populations that never built an empire and never got a mythology.
They lived in the Levant, modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. Before farming, before writing, before cities existed, they were hunter-gatherers who were in the slow, stumbling process of becoming something else.
Archaeological evidence suggests the Natufians were among the first humans on Earth to experiment with cultivating wild grasses, to build semi-permanent settlements with stone foundations, to develop the earliest recognizable precursors of agriculture.
They were, in a very real sense, the people who started the experiment that led to civilization as we understand it. Not the people who completed it, the ones who started it clumsily, in a landscape that was greener and wetter than it is today. And then, as Neolithic farming populations expanded out of the Fertile Crescent across the Middle East and into Europe, the Natufian genetic signature got diluted, absorbed, folded into newer mixtures. You can find traces of it in modern populations across a wide region, but it's almost never the dominant signal, except in one comparison. When you stack the genetic core of modern Arab populations against ancient populations, the Natufians come closest. This doesn't mean modern Arabs are direct linear descendants of Natufians with nothing in between.
Human genetics doesn't work that cleanly, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling a story, not science.
What it means is that the ancient population that most closely resembles the foundational genetic layer of modern Arab identity is this pre-agricultural, pre-empire, pre-literacy group of people who lived in the Levant more than 10,000 years ago. The layers of Arab history are all present in the genome too. The ancient kingdoms, the Islamic expansion, the centuries of trade and war and migration have all left marks. But underneath all of that, the deepest detectable signal points to people who predated every civilization we have a name for. Hold that thought for a second, because the implications are strange. The Arab world has spent centuries defining its identity through specific histories. Through Islam, through the Arabic language, through narrative connecting modern Arab peoples to the great ancient civilizations of the Near East, to Babylon, to Phoenicia, to ancient Egypt, to the Nabateans, to the great trading kingdoms of South Arabia. These are powerful stories, they're meaningful stories. And here's a genetics lab in Germany saying, we found your deepest root, and it's before all of that. Before the Quran and before the pyramids, and before Babylon and before writing itself existed. That's either humbling or liberating, depending on how you hold it. And the researchers were careful about one thing. The Natufian signal is the closest match, but it's not a clean, exclusive one. Modern Arab DNA also carries significant ancestry from Neolithic Iranian plateau populations, the groups that thousands of years later contributed to Mesopotamian civilizations. It carries Bronze Age admixture from multiple directions, including populations from the Caucasus that moved through the region during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. The Natufian signal is the loudest note, but this is not a one-note genome, which is actually the more honest version of what genetics tells us about any human group. We're not sealed containers of a single ancestry. We're palimpsests, documents where older writing keeps bleeding through newer layers, where you can hold a page up to the light and see 4 different hands at once. And the story of Arab genetics might be the most extreme version of that palimpsest anywhere in the world. Here's why. The Middle East is the single most trafficked region in all of human prehistory. Geographically, it's the land bridge between 3 continents. Climatically, It swung between wet and arid in cycles that forced mass migrations every few thousand years. Historically, it's where the first empires formed and collapsed, where Bronze Age trade networks connected Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. Every major population movement in Eurasian prehistory either started in the Middle East, ended there, or cut through it. Modern Arab populations carry all of that. They carry the genetic memory of Natufian hunter-gatherers and Iranian Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age merchants and ancient Greeks who came east with Alexander and sub-Saharan Africans who moved north along Red Sea trade routes and Central Asian steppe peoples who pushed west. The entire Eurasian story is compressed into one genome, which makes the Natufian match more interesting, not less. Because the real question becomes, how did that signal survive? With all that layering, all that migration, all that mixing across 10,000 years, how does the oldest signal stay detectable at all? The answer geneticists give is that the Middle East, despite being a crossroads, also contains populations with remarkable demographic continuity.
Certain communities in Yemen, in Oman, in rural southern Jordan, in parts of Iraq, communities that stayed relatively isolated not by geography but by culture, by deep traditions of endogamy, by staying in the same valleys and the same agricultural patterns for hundreds of generations. These communities function as genetic anchors.
They preserved signals that more mobile populations diluted to near invisibility. And those anchoring populations are what keeps pulling the statistical center of Arab genetics back toward the Natufian baseline. So when you see a headline like Arab DNA matches ancient civilization, the real story isn't a lock and key match. It's about a gravitational center across enormous geographic diversity, across 400 million people, across 22 countries,
and thousands of years of different and sometimes violently divergent histories. There is a shared genetic gravity that keeps pointing back to these Levantine hunter-gatherers who were figuring out how to plant wheat before anyone had invented the concept of ownership, let alone civilization.
There's one more thing worth sitting with before we're done. The Natufians are not a civilization with a mythology. There's no religion organized around them. No national identity claiming their heritage. No country that puts them in a textbook as founding ancestors. They existed and they mattered, and then they got folded into what came after, and mostly forgotten. What we know about them comes entirely from bones in limestone caves, from stone tools, from the occasional ancient hearth. They left no writing because writing didn't exist. They left no monuments because they hadn't conceived of monuments yet. And yet genetically, they may be the single most influential population in the story of the modern Middle East. Not because of what they built, but because of what they were before building began, before anyone thought to build anything at all. That is a strange kind of inheritance, to carry the DNA of people who had absolutely no idea what was coming, who couldn't have imagined cities or empires or prophets or the concept of an Arab nation or a genetics lab in Germany running their bones through a sequencer 15,000 years later. People who woke up and thought about water sources and hunting grounds and whether the winter was coming early, and whose genetic signature outlasted every empire, every conquest, every plague, every migration that followed them. The scientists compared Arab DNA to every ancient civilization they had samples for. They ruled out Egypt. They ruled out Mesopotamia. They ruled out the Phoenicians and the Canaanites as the primary match. And at the end, the closest signal pointed to people who weren't a civilization at all. The ones who were just on the edge of becoming one. If that doesn't make you think differently about what ancestry means, about whose story gets remembered in texts and whose gets stored in bone, I'm not sure what would. Drop a comment with the ancient population you think is the most underrated in how we understand human history. Because there are several strong candidates, and I genuinely want to know which one lands with you.